Hi and welcome back to the That's Business channel, where you learn the most in the least amount of time. Before we begin, remember to like and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell to never miss a video. It happens to all of us at some point. We're reading a text and at the end of the paragraph, we don't remember what the F we just read. We then go back to the beginning to reread and again try to process and understand the information. Maybe sometimes even twice or 3 times. We can all agree this is totally annoying and even frustrating to not be able to concentrate for more than 10 words. This is more common than you might think, and we can all understand the problems it can cause in life. Whether it is in school, at work, or in our personal life, it would be highly preferable to actually remember what we read. Fear no longer. We are here to teach you how to do just that. Number 1. Send yourself an email. Amongst all the strategies that has been developed to memorize what has been read, perhaps this one that Shay Howe exposes in Medium is one of the more interesting ones. It has actually allowed him to read one book every 2 weeks, and every time squeeze the absolute most from their content. This method starts with some old-fashioned highlighting. But Howe reveals that highlighting, even though it is very important, is only the beginning. After Howe finishes a book, he rereads the highlights he has made in order to reinforce the key lessons and concept, he says. An hour or so should be enough. Once finished, Howe makes his own written summary in an email and sends it to himself to always have it at hand. But that's not all. Not only does he send himself the email with the summary, but he also schedules a second email with the same summary for him to receive again at some point later. This way, he is reminded of the content of the book just as his memory starts to fade. He means that with this method, he is periodically refreshing what he has learned. This way of remembering what you've read requires time to read and make highlights, but also time to refresh your memory. Doing this will not only help improve your short-term memory, but it's also a way of adding it to your long-term one. The more you remind yourself of what you once learned, the easier it will be for you to remember it for a longer period. For when we do something repeatedly, we make an impact on our brain. Because of this impact, our brain sees this as something more important than something we only do once. Number 2. Take notes. This might not sound like such a revolutionary tip, but it is, however, a very underestimated one. This is one of the most common memorization practices. And if you don't want to do as the previous advice suggested and fill your books with strokes of highlights, then this might be a better option for you. This advice starts out the same way as the previous one. Pick out what is the most important in the text you are reading, things that catch your attention. But instead of making highlights, you take notes. Either take notes directly in your book or in a separate notebook. However, the latter is not as effective because you can easily lose sense of direction interaction with the text and therefore lose your focus. A compromise would be to make notes on post-its and stick them on the page in the book. This advice can be backed up by many experts and the most inveterate fans of organisation and reading. They even recommend you never start reading without a pencil in your hand. Number 3. Discuss what you have read. I think we can agree that knowledge is only good if you actually get to use it. I mean, if not, then what's the point? But what people might not know is that using your knowledge also helps you to remember it better. This is because of what we spoke about in the previous advice, repeating. However, this advice takes it a few steps further. Instead of repeating by rereading, here we repeat by talking. Discussing or explaining what you have just read to a friend, even an imaginary one, can help in more ways than just letting you repeat what you have learned or read. It also allows your brain to think about what you are repeating in another way, because once you start telling someone, you start to put it into your own words. This will also show if you really understand what you just read, especially if the person you were talking to starts asking questions. Having someone ask you questions on the matter can get you to think in ways about the subject you haven't before. And it also attaches the information you were talking about to those questions and even the whole situation. By attaching information to something, you again make an impact on your brain, and it has more than one reason to remember. Not just reading it and retelling it to someone, but also from having to explain it and answer questions. Number 4. Ask yourself questions. If you don't have anyone with whom you can or want to discuss what you are reading, you can try this out. Whether you are studying or trying to memorize something for another purpose, it always helps to think about what you are reading from the point of view of someone who would quiz you. A teacher, for example. Even if you are not studying the text or book you are reading, you can still pretend someone will quiz you on it just for the sake of this practice. This is not to try and stress you out, but simply to make you read from another point of view. Ask yourself questions on what you are reading. Think of things a teacher would ask. This way, you can check yourself if you actually understood what you just read or if your eyes just drifted over the words. If you think it hard to think of questions and you don't have someone else who can help you out with this, you can always Google questions for learning a text. Number 5. Read superficially first. This advice might feel unhelpful at first and honestly a waste of time, but hear us out. According to Bill Clem, Professor of Neuroscience at Texas A&M University, it is worth the hassle. Looking at the book or paragraph as a whole before diving into it properly is a way of looking at something with two different sets of eyes. This does not only mean you repeat the text, but it also means you read it in two different ways. And therefore, the information also enters your brain in two different ways. When reading something superficially, you will notice things you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And when you read it again, it creates an anchor between you and the text, and you have then attached your memory to that anchor. Superficially, you will notice things you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And when you read it again, it creates an anchor between you and the text, and you have then attached your memory to that anchor. Dr. Bill Clem says any material that needs to be studied carefully should be skim-read first. Number 6. Think in images. This is called the method of association and works by attaching the information to something just like explained in a few of the previous advices. This method of association that uses images is most common in children's books, but it works just as well for adults. Everyone's memory works differently, but many of us have a more visual memory rather than verbal or numerical. Therefore, by transforming the words we read into pictures, we can have an easier time remembering them. This can be done by trying to act out what you are reading or visualize how a children's book illustration would look if it was done on the text. A picture is worth more than 1,000 words. A somewhat similar strategy to this one is the one used by actors when they memorize their scripts. They don't just learn their lines word for word, they get into it, they become it. They understand the meaning of each word and in what context they are used by visualizing the scene in their head and acting it out. This way, by learning to understand the depth of the script, the actors seem to achieve automatic memorization. Number 7. Don't overload yourself with information. It's always better to remember a little bit correctly than a lot but completely wrong. In order to do this, we need to try and limit the amount of information we give our brain access to and give it time to process it accordingly. Reading a book, for example, is a way of purposely giving your brain access to information. But there are ways we do this that is not on purpose. Things that take more of our attention than we might realize. Maybe you can guess what I'm going on about. Phones, computers, TV, radio, etc. It's a big part of our modern world, and it would be impossible to conceal ourselves from it completely. And that's not even the goal. The goal is to limit how much we expose ourselves to these things. Be aware of the amount of information you expose to your brain, to not overstimulate it. Overstimulation will not result in you having more knowledge. Quite the opposite, actually. This also applies to making our brain take in information by reading. If you read too much too fast without giving your brain time to process everything it's exposed to, you will be left with nothing more than a reading hangover. which is a lot of headache and no memory of what you read the night before. This one is the one tip you should always practice, no matter if you choose to try any of the other tips presented as well. Don't give yourself a reading hangover. This will just bring you stress and the feeling of wasting time reading something you don't even remember. Make sure you start reading in time to be able to take breaks and resume with a clearer mind. This is some of the most recommended advice out there, and I'm sure you will find at least one to help you on your journey to remembering more of what you read. Remember, the reason most of these recommendations work is because of repetition and many different learning techniques used on the same text. Reading, listening, speaking, writing, and visualizing. The more ways you let your brain work in, the bigger impact the information will have on you and your memory. We have now reached the end of the video. We hope you learned something new. We know we did. Let us know in the comments what you would like to see next. This was Remember What You Read on the That's Business channel. Thank you for watching and take care.